it's really just about being honest. I think this relates to entrepreneurship because you want to put your best face forward and have this polished image. But are we just truly being honest? Are we living for God or for some ulterior reason? It's an important conversation around entrepreneurship because we will really be able to do what God's will for us is in this effort to the extent that we are doing this for Him and not for others.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Catholic Founders Podcast, where we discover how to run your business like a saint. Today, we had the absolute pleasure to speak with Jennifer Baugh, the founder of Young Catholic Professionals, normally referred to as YCP. And if you're unfamiliar with YCP, it's effectively a chapter-based association of young Catholic professionals all around the US, and soon, I think, globally. Each chapter typically hosts at least one event per month to help engage the local young Catholic professionals, to give them a community and a place where they can go deeper in their faith. They now have 42 chapters around the US, and they continue to grow rapidly. Jennifer recently actually stepped down as the executive director and is just an advisor. So we took this time to kind of go with her and look back at the lessons that she's learned over, I think it was over 14 years of running YCP. So some of the things we discussed were, what traits she tends to notice people have if they're going to go on to start their own business. She shared a lot about the specific virtues that she thinks are required to be an entrepreneur. And then we also talked about why you don't need to start a nonprofit if you want to build something that's mission oriented. She actually shared a little bit of her thoughts on YCP as a nonprofit versus, if it had been a for-profit. And then how Catholics who achieve success should be more open to sharing their story and their success, as well as the framework for how to do this in a humble way. I think this is a very important thing. That was probably my favorite part of the conversation, if I'm being honest. And then she talked about how to balance family while building a business and while she was building YCP. Keep in mind, during the time of creating and building YCP, she got married and had 4 children. So she has a very interesting perspective there. This is truly a special conversation because Jennifer is just so filled with wisdom and joy about her work that it's really impossible to not feel inspired after listening to this. And she also has amazing quotes that she shares throughout the episode. All right, one last thing before we get into the episode. If you have not already, do check out our free weekly newsletter called The Saintly CEO. Comes out every Monday morning and gives you a little bit of a tidbit of advice on how to run your business like a saint in under 1,000 words. It's completely free, so sign up today. All right, without any further delay, let's get into the episode. All right, welcome to the show, Jennifer. How are you doing today?
Great, how are you?
I am fine as frog hair, as my dad would usually say. I'm just enjoying life. It's summer in Wisconsin, so there's not much to complain about.
Wow, take me with you because
Yeah, it seems like there's no perfect place in the world. If you live in Texas, you get nice winters, but you got to get out of there in the summers.
it's all about building up resilience.
Yes, exactly. I lived in Florida for 2 months at one point, and it was actually in the summer, and I never really adapted to it. I did not like it, but
Oh no, the humidity weighs on you like a coat.
exactly. Yep. And my northern body was not built for that, so that's all right. But tell us a little bit. A lot of people will be very familiar with what you're doing and what you've built with YCP. But for anybody who may not be familiar, just give us a quick intro to yourself and what you're doing today.
Jennifer Baugh, founder of Young Catholic Professionals, a beautiful apostolate that God called me to initiate. And it's really about embracing our beautiful Catholic faith and bringing it into the everyday, ordinary, sometimes challenging, sometimes mundane moments of our work life. We are called to contribute and be collaborators with God. He's given us many gifts and many talents. And when we open ourselves up to His will for our lives, the possibilities are endless. And so we really help young Catholics embrace who they are in their identity as beloved daughters and sons of God. We give them the supportive community, so we connect them to each other so they realize they're not alone, to one another, and also to, exemplary Catholics who have gone before us through mentorship and more. And then finally, we give them a challenge to say, take this great gift and go transform the culture through the everyday witness of your life. And so we now have chapters in 42 cities across the country and counting. And it's really a powerful national movement that is transforming, I think, the culture.
Yeah, I would have definitely agree. I don't know if you know this or not, but I actually was part of the leadership team for the New York City Apostolate with Joe Putnick at one point. Great individual, and I really like what you guys are doing. I think admittedly, I come from a very rural area, and when I first moved to New York City, some people were saying like, you should check out these YCP things, and I was always a little skeptical of these items, but I realized after being part of it, like how important it is to have this kind of this landing pad, if you will, for people, because it's so in growing up around family in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin, it was easier. But once you move into the world and you're far away from family and in New York City or any city for that matter, just the allure of the world is so difficult, and you need a place to find friends, and especially for those people who may have left the faith or kind of fallen away to an extent during college, you need a little bit of an easy way in. You don't want to be intimidated too much. So I really appreciate what you've done.
Thank you.
When did you start this? Like how long ago has this been going? Because you're at 42 cities now. How long did it take
Yeah.
to get there?
Well, August of 2010, so we're about to celebrate our 15th anniversary. So, I mean, it's just amazing because, I mean, you obviously interview a lot of entrepreneurs and the average nonprofit, the average really entity doesn't last too long. And so the fact that we're now 15 years in and still going strong, I really think it's a testament to the need for this. And, just a blessing for me also. I mean, obviously I've been very intimately involved, but also to just watch it grow because it really is God's apostolate. It's a movement of the Holy Spirit. So to also be in a position where I'm actually witnessing what's happening with it, it's awe-inspiring.
Yeah, it's really amazing what can be done when we step aside and let God, take the reins. We have ideas and we have to, comply with those desires, if you will. But God can take it and make it so much bigger than we ever imagined, right? You've got some very interesting thoughts about the way that the business world can be a sort of a mission field. Could you talk to us, kind of explain the premise there, explain that a little bit more?
Yes, one of our first conferences with YCP examined Brother Lawrence, who is a French Carmelite. He's famous for his work practicing the presence of God, and he said, depend upon changing our works, but in doing them for God's sake. He also said, so there's really this challenge to offer our very selves to God. And, we spend such a great amount of our day working. And I think the average person sadly disassociates those hours from their calling as a Catholic. And so we're really just hoping to share that there is great dignity in work. The Son of God, our Lord, spent, the majority of his life working. And that tells us that it's a great avenue for our holiness, that work is part of our path to heaven. And so I think the real message there is that we can't just view it as something where we make a paycheck or kind of go through the motions or even engage in just sort of the secular tendencies to, engage in office politics or whatever it is. We have to see it as part of our higher calling, and that transforms our everyday. And then once we are kind of transformed, we can actually witness to our Catholic faith through our work. There's a quote from Pope Paul VI that says, modern man listens more willingly to witnesses than to teachers. And if he does listen to teachers, it's because they are witnesses. So I think there's this profound opportunity, maybe more than in other circumstances, where, if we're consistent in our everyday actions at work, it's about being consistent, it's about being virtuous, generous with our soul and our offering. That can really be a signal to someone that we are working for God, like you said before, working for God rather than for man. And there really is that choice, and we have to show through our actions that we're serving God and not man. So work is really a platform for all of this to take place. Our own personal growth, our personal quest for heaven, but also a profound opportunity for us to witness.
Can you say more about that, the personal growth piece of work? Because I think a lot of people, I mean, you've already alluded to this. A lot of people view it as sort of a necessary evil, like, I got to go to work, you gotta pay the bills. Can you talk about maybe some of the stories that you've heard, or maybe even personally for you, the way that you've developed personally or spiritually through work broadly, not just entrepreneurship?
Yes, I mean, I think, there's so many aspects to work where we can really stretch ourselves and deepen as faithful people. We have to practice virtue just in the course of everyday work. Work is sometimes demanding, so we have to be patient. Work can be, like we said before, monotonous, and so we have to see, a higher purpose. There can be opportunity for us to practice humility in the workplace. Many times, there can be an opportunity for us to practice generosity when we're giving more than what's asked of us, and we're going beyond. All of these different avenues. And what about just simply creativity? That is an opportunity for us to open ourselves up to God. We're most creative when we open ourselves to the divine. When we stay in this little trap of trying to force creativity or force an interesting idea using our own effort. It's almost like in tennis where you're trying to make the ball go hard with your arms instead of your legs. It's like if we open ourselves up to God, we can be truly creative and produce much more than we ever imagined. So work, because it's so multifaceted, because you're dealing with people, because you're trying to create things and produce things and solve problems, opportunity to practice our faith, right? I mean, sure, we can practice our faith outside of working hours, but then we have really more freedom to kind of go about things in our own way. Whereas in work, we have to sort of adapt and be agile. And so I think it's this amazing ground for us to grow as individuals through the different things that are thrown our way and see if we can really imitate Christ. I mean, there's this amazing quote, attributed to our Lord as basically saying, watch your pace today and see if you are either hurrying or delaying. Because if you really follow me, I neither hurry nor delay. And so what an awesome opportunity at work are to see, are we hurried or are we delaying, or are we really following the pace of Christ and really seeking to do his will in the everyday? I think it's because work offers all of these opportunities to us that it is an incredible avenue for us to grow.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with this. I think just to point out some of to recircle on some of the things you mentioned is the humiliation of opportunities at work, the opportunity to practice virtue at work. It's really great because I remember this especially in the beginning of my career when I had just moved to New York City. I had learned how to do sales very well, but I was starting a new job in recruitment sector, and I had no idea how to do recruitment. I had no idea, about the industry that I was working in. It was all new, and there are so many times where you just make absolutely terrible mistakes, and then you have to face the consequences and not get discouraged, right? You learn how to go beyond that and to push yourself. But then also as you develop and you start to manage people, then you have to do the same for other people and have the patience. Like all of these virtues play very, very well into being in business, regardless of, whether you own the business or not. And this was like, I think the original thesis for Catholic Founders was, back in I think 2019, I thought of this. I said, if Jesus was a CEO of a company and he exhibit, perfect virtue in everything, I feel like his business would be one of the, most profitable businesses that exist, right? And I think that that's a really, really helpful perspective there. Do you feel specifically that entrepreneurship was the way for your faith to flourish as well?
Absolutely. Just like we were speaking about virtue, I really think that I had to cultivate some key virtues in order for the ministry, the apostolate to be viable. And through acquisition of these virtues, my faith was able to grow deeper than perhaps it would have on its own. I think specifically of three virtues that come to mind. One, of course, as you can imagine, would be courage, right? It took a lot of courage at the beginning to take the risk, especially when others may have doubted, the vision or not understood it. So to just kind of take that leap and press on, I really had to kind of dive into courage. The next one was perseverance. So just like anybody listening, I mean, to really grow something and scale something, you're going to encounter an enormous amount of challenges. And so there were so many times I could have just, quit, jumped ship, but I kept going. And so I think really kind of honing in and cultivating that virtue was key for YCP's growth and for me personally. And then finally, trust, So most recently, about a year ago, I stepped away from the executive director role to step into an advisor role so that I could really dive into family life. Also, through prayer, seeing that it was necessary for the apostolate to undergo that change, that the apostolate was ready for it. And so I really had to trust. I mean, can you imagine something that has become my identity for all of these years, and really to step away has been really challenging, but really leaning into trust and knowing that this is God's apostolate and that it will flourish according to his holy will, really cultivating the virtue of trust has been key. And so I think really my faith has grown through those three key virtues. On top of that, I will say, just from a personality standpoint, I am both a high achiever and someone who's very eager to please at the same
Hmm.
time. And so some may consider that to be, and I've found it to be quite contradictory for most of my life. And so there were a ton of times, growing YCP where I either took setbacks personally, people's opinions might have weighed on me. And so I think really my faith matured along the way when I really, it's that scripture verse about trust in the Lord and lean not on your own understanding. Really that became meaningful for me as I learned to just really surrender and, not need to make sense of everything. And I think in that way, as I continue to really embrace that quote from scripture, I think my faith has matured. And so I'm so grateful for this experience and for what it's doing for me and will continue to do.
Yeah, I mean, I could comment on this. We actually, I recorded another podcast this morning and we talked a little bit about this idea of over spiritualizing, how we build our businesses. And sometimes it's easy as Catholics to just be like, hey, called me to do it. So, I'm going to do this thing, regardless if it makes financial sense, right? But at the same time, there is so much of it where we have to, like you said, lean on that scripture verse is great. That we have to lean on what God has in store for us because if we only think about what's possible kind of from our own limited understanding, we're limiting a huge potential future, right, of what God could achieve through us, right?
Yes.
I appreciate that.
Particularly hard for entrepreneurs, right? Because we're kind of
Yes.
analytical by nature, problem solving, wanting to kind of put our spin on things, right? And so to really surrender and let go, I think it's probably extra hard for entrepreneurs. But when you can at least make that effort, I think God can do powerful things.
Yeah, 100%. Did you always want to own your own business or to build something? Like, was this kind of ingrained in you since a young age?
Would say not really. However, I did have kind of creative parents, so entrepreneurship was definitely part of my family life, my upbringing. I mean, there was definitely a sense where you didn't have to follow the status quo. My aunt was a fine artist, my brother started off as a musician. I think there was definitely an openness to go off the path and do your own thing. I wouldn't say though I had the kind of the foresight to say, "Oh, I want to start my own business." And reflecting on that, I think that was actually probably why YCP really took off at the beginning is I think people could tell my sincerity of purpose here, that it wasn't because I wanted to do my own thing or that it was some sort of checking off some sort of box that I had for personal goals. They could see that I was so passionate about this need and
Hmm.
about this effort that I think they really were extra eager to come in and to help me, right? They could tell that there was real authenticity there. And so I would say not really, however, yes, an openness to the adventure. My dad's favorite word is adventure. I think mine would probably be journey, and the sense that we are on this pilgrimage, and really I think entrepreneurship fits in quite well with that, about being open to risk. And so I think just the whole message there is that it's totally fine to want to start your own business. I know tons of people who have that dream and that bent, and I would just say just make sure the passion for whatever you're doing is more important or more significant than your personal desire to start something new.
Yeah, no, that's powerful. You've encountered a lot of young professionals, obviously, through the work you've done. Are there any particular themes that you've noticed in people that are more likely to become entrepreneurs? Because again, you yourself are not somebody who intended for this to happen per se, but you kind of leaned into to your natural tendencies and eventually built something, nonprofit or not, it doesn't matter. Still entrepreneurship. So like, what are the things that you notice as kind of themes that really you think, hey, that person's probably going to do something?
Yeah. We spoke about the three virtues: courage, perseverance, and trust. And I think there's some kind of categories within those virtues. So under courage, you really have to be willing to take a risk. And I think it's got to be calculated risk, but to venture into the unknown. I think those who are more entrepreneurial are willing to do that. It's uncomfortable, but they're okay being uncomfortable, right? And then secondly, under courage would be just passion. People with an incredible amount of passion for an idea or for a venture. You have to be a passionate person. Under perseverance, I think an important topic is resilience. You have to be okay continuing on in spite of setbacks and failures, because there will be so many. And if you're not willing to endure hard times, if you're not willing to kind of put in that effort and really endure, you have to question if it's the right path for you. The next part under perseverance, I think, is a growth mindset. You have to be open to the journey of learning. You have to see this as something where you're going to grow. Problem solving, you have to be resourceful. You have to want to solve problems proactively. You can't wait for someone else to do that for you. And then self-discipline, you have to be motivated. You can't need someone else to provide that motivation for you. You have to do it for yourself. And then lastly, under trust, I think you have to be adaptable and flexible. So just like in my own journey of kind of pivoting when I felt like God was really calling me to that next step and calling the apostolate, I think you as an entrepreneur have to be someone who can change and be flexible and be agile. And also, have that confidence in God that He will equip you if this is something that He has ordained. So I really think those three aspects are the recipe for entrepreneurial success.
Yeah. So this is a great segue. Once people have, maybe identified that they have some of those core things, and you said, that God has ordained that they try this, and they're hesitant. What is your piece of advice to help push them over the edge and say, hey, you know what? You just got to trust in God and go for this.
So my brother I mentioned, was a singer-songwriter. He's now actually in the seminary. One of my favorite lyrics, he was doing Christian music, and one of my favorite lyrics is from a song he has called Show Me Grace, and basically talks about being afraid. And he says, I'm selfish when I'm afraid, but every time I do, I turn to you because your love points the way. And I just think that's so interesting about our fear can actually make us selfish. Think about that even with our anxieties and our hesitations. Are we actually limiting what God has in store for us through this venture, through this entrepreneurial effort? We make it too much about ourselves. Maybe this is what God is planning, and we need to make sure that our own fears and insecurities are not preventing us from doing something that could benefit the kingdom, could benefit others. So, within that, I think, it's really important to, address the fear. Why am I afraid at this moment? Is it something that's really factual, or is it really based on assumption? So I think you have to kind of dive in, and you need to have self-awareness, right, to really examine what's causing the fear. The next thing I would totally recommend is planning. I did an immense amount of planning before starting YCP. I wrote a business plan that factored in even international expansion. I had the financials, and of course we didn't follow the business plan to a T, but it's amazing looking back to see how much has actually stayed the same. And so I think having that roadmap really helped, I think, put aside some of the anxieties, because there was a plan. It wasn't something where it was so open-ended. So I would really encourage entrepreneurs as much as they can to do analysis, market research, even potentially start with something small, and the concept of an MVP, because that helps you to eliminate risk and kind of, again, be agile at the beginning. It's so important. And then lastly, if you're afraid, seek a support system. It's so important. And I think you believe in this clearly through what you're doing right here, right? But just helping people support each other, connect, find encouragement, find mentors, find those who have, gone before you in a similar way. And do not be afraid to ask for help.
Yeah, amen. I think the asking for help piece is something that it requires humility, obviously, but a lot of people don't, especially Americans. We tend to be very focused on being able to do it ourselves. So, no, I appreciate that, and that's a great plug for people to become part of the Catholic Founders community.
Yeah. Yeah.
But do you have this is something I think I try to think about when I started my own business. Do you have a particular framework for how to put the outcomes of what you're doing in God's hands while still ensuring that you're doing the work He's seeking for you to do?
Not to always be quoting the saints, but they're so epic. And, a quote that comes to mind is Saint Ignatius of Loyola. I think it's attributed to him. He says, "Pray as if everything depends on you, and work as if everything depends on God." And, in a way that reminds me, are you familiar with the Stockdale paradox?
Mm,
It was, I think, kind of brought to light through Jim Collins' book, Good to Great. But
mm,
basically, a famous admiral who was a Vietnam War prisoner of war, who endured tons of years of torture and uncertainty, but never lost his faith, and ultimately survived and became one of the most decorated admirals after the fact. And so
mhm.
basically, he said it was two things that enabled him to survive successfully when so many failed. One is that he had, unwavering optimism that he would ultimately be successful. And then the second one is he was able to confront reality. He was able to take stock of the brutal facts in front of him. And so the balance of those two things, he said, helped him survive. The reason I bring that up for entrepreneurship is, I think it's important for entrepreneurs to embrace both of those to build resilience for the journey. One is you have to have faith that you will be successful at the end of the day. You have to have that hope. And that's why what you're doing, again, is so important. Catholic founders, not just founders, Catholic founders, we have to rely on our faith to give us that hope. But secondly, we have to be self-aware enough where we can take stock of what is in front of us and what really is at our disposal. What are our resources? We have to be honest about that. What is the market need? What is the demand? What are my gaps? What are my strengths? I think we have to really be honest. I think there's a lot of people out there who maybe have rose-colored glasses too much, or the opposite, right? And so I think the combination of the two does resonate with the quote from Saint Ignatius, where it's a combination of relying 100% on God, but doing everything that we can with a spirit of honesty.
Yeah, no, I've thought about that quote a bit as well. I think it's actually also included somewhere in the catechism as well. Um, yeah, there's so many good things there. I really appreciate the thoughts. One thing I was very curious to ask you about is also this idea of, why did you create YCP as a nonprofit instead of a for-profit? Because a lot of people, I think that there's, maybe you can speak to your reasoning here, but a lot of people I find they want to do something powerful for the church and something kind of mission oriented, and they always assume it has to be a nonprofit, and they go that route rather than building a business and then having some kind of financial engine behind it to then deploy money into different kind of missionary objectives. Can you talk about your mentality there and what you think is kind of the, I guess if you will, the which way you should go if you want to go nonprofit, and what are the circumstances when you do a for-profit entity?
Yeah, such an interesting conversation. I think looking back 15 years ago at the founding of YCP, I wasn't sophisticated at that point to really, have analyzed the difference. For me at that moment, I was starting a ministry, and a ministry, I wasn't even thinking about any sort of financial aspect to it. I just really wanted to be able to get it off the ground and reach as many people as possible, and I didn't want anything related to finances to be any sort of a barrier.
Mm.
It was that simple at the time. But as I've grown and met so many inspirational people, so many entrepreneurs who actually view their business as a ministry, their for-profit business as a ministry, I've come to learn that it's really not that simple, that actually a for-profit can be as noble, if not more noble, than a nonprofit. And so I think it's a really interesting question that requires a lot of discernment, a lot of prayer, and there's really no right or wrong answer, I don't think. I think it depends on what the entrepreneur thinks God is calling them to do. Because you're right, in a for-profit, you could potentially expand and grow much faster, acquire much more in the form of resources to then employ more people. But when you employ people, that's a ministry in itself, right? Because we need strong families today in this world. Strong families need financial freedom, need philanthropists for our church. So there's just so many layers to this, of even just viewing the way that you hire as a way to honor God and employ more people. If you are able to raise a significant amount of funds, there's so much that you can do. There's so many cool side ministries that these businesses now have, where they donate a percentage of their profits to, the charity of their cause, or of their passion. So I think it's not as simple as, if you want to do something good, start a nonprofit. It's not that simple. In fact, I would actually urge people probably to consider for-profit business, because there is such an opportunity there to do a ton of good. Also be countercultural when there's a ton of businesses out there that are just seeking profit, and that's the sole motive, in a very transactional way. You can be a business owner that is doing much more and actually elevating the purpose to heaven. So I don't know if that's kind of the response you were imagining, but I think my thought process on it has shifted as I've gone through all
Yeah.
this.
No, it makes a lot of sense to me, and I really appreciate that. I had the assumption that if Jennifer knows what she knows now, she may have gone back and built it as a for-profit entity, but I'm
Yeah.
not going to put you on the spot and ask you that, but
Yeah.
this idea that we have to separate mission from business is I don't believe is a good way to look at it. And I mean, we've
Yeah.
had Jeff Scheffelbein on the pod, and he's talked about this undivided life piece, right? I'm sure you're very familiar with him. I think he's an advisor to YCP, actually, right?
My
Jeff?
husband actually works with him.
Oh, he does. Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
So yeah, so you know Jeff very well,
Very well.
and he's a great guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, the most recent thing I thought was hilarious with Jeff is that viral video of the Father's Day shirts thing, and of course it happened at the place where Jeff goes to church.
I know.
But anyways, no, I really appreciate that. I think it's there's so much impact that can be made, and we could integrate our we must integrate our faith into the way we run our businesses and run our lives, and that would include how everything's done, right? Especially the treatment of employees. There's so many good writings about how, especially from JP2, how work is made for man and not man for work, that we must continue to elevate the dignity of man through work. So I really appreciate that. If I'm not mistaken, as you were building YCP, you started your family, and this whole process of like building something is very difficult as it
Yes.
is. And then on top of that, you apply the family side of things. So how do you approach, or how do you think about approaching entrepreneurship and family life together, as a Catholic specifically?
Yes. I mean, it's been such an amazing journey. Like you said, getting married in the middle of the apostolate and then literally having 4 kids in a span of 6 years has been a wild ride. I think truly I couldn't have endured without my faith. We talk about resilience before because there's a lot of demands on my time and not just on my time, on sort of my spirit too, right? You have to give yourself in each of these areas. And it's not just like a traditional job. Really when you're a founder, you really have to give yourself up because you want God to be, directing your path. And so, it really required a lot from me. And I will say, really staying close to my faith, staying close to the sacraments, having a strong devotion to the rosary, really, making the most of the Holy Mass, of being as present as I can to really receive all the graces that I can. Also relying so much on the prayer of others. I mean, my mom had the Carmelites, cloistered Carmelites praying for us all these years and for me. And so leveraging the prayers of others, really having friendship with the saints. Saint Joseph is my go-to, my best friend. And so, really thanking him for his help, and then also just being so aligned with my husband. Cody is such a virtuous person. We talk about Saint Joseph. He reminds me a lot of Saint Joseph in his sacrifice, in his steadiness and consistency. And really, Cody's belief in YCP was so strong that it was really like I had his teamwork, not just in the logistics, but in the spiritual side. I had his teamwork with me, propelling me forward and supporting and bolstering me. And so I think, it's so important, in a family life, you have to have that teamwork with your spouse, really from a spiritual side too. And then I think, just being very careful. I think any entrepreneur, you become so engrossed in what you're doing. It's hard not to, right? But I've had to be so careful that I don't prioritize YCP over my family. That's my first priority. It's like they're my primary vocation, my sweet little ones and my husband. And so it's a constant examination of conscience to ask myself, where am I prioritizing my time? And I, really every single day having to ask myself that question and then shift, adjust, not regret anything. I mean, just like Saint Therese, it's not about looking back. It's about saying, God, I'll start again and I'll do better and try my best. And I think it's that constant effort every single day to adjust and really ask myself, am I doing what God wants me to do? I think that's what's allowed me to juggle both. And then also having support. You mentioned Jeff and so many other people that are on the same path. And I think having them as a almost like an anchor to see, am I shifting, someone to remind you of your center. And I think that's what friends for the journey are supposed to do. Friendships are not just to make you feel good about yourself. Friendships are there to challenge you and remind you who you are and what you stand for. And I'm so thankful, through YCP that I've met some exceptional people that have helped me in that journey of being an entrepreneur, but also a person who prioritizes family.
No, that's really powerful. So I just kind of recap the core things. It seems like, it's a constant battle to try to remember how can I balance this? And there's no one size fits all, but you just have to have regular check-ins. And it's the same way with our spiritual life. We can never let things get off the rails. We have to have regular check-ins with that, but also having, like you said, anchors or people who are willing to give you the hard truths, right? If you will. I think
Yes.
this is something I find a lot of people, especially in America, they have a very hard time with this being vulnerable piece. Like there's people I've known since my entire life from church who they've never told me a single vulnerable thing about their lives, right? It's like I've literally known them my whole life, and I don't know, I just know them, from church or whatever. But I think we have to be willing to share some of this and be open up a bit, because I think that it would be we would never assume that Jesus would not say these things, right? I think Jesus would, he's very vulnerable in all these ways. So I appreciate that. You know, no, go ahead.
Just something about honesty, right? Because I think even like this, the word vulnerable, it can become like almost like a buzzword, where it's like be vulnerable, but I think the secular world is sort of taken that word on, where it just means sort of sharing. But it's like when you're just really honest with someone, you can't help but share the truth of your life. You can't help but share the good and the bad and the hard, in humility. It's really just about being honest. There's nothing that we have to present this image of ourselves, and again, I think this relates to entrepreneurship, is because you want to sort of put your best face forward and have this polished image and all of this, but and that is sort of important, right? Because you have to inspire confidence in others as you're
Hmm.
getting your thing off the ground. But I think it's also just important to put that in check with just, am I being an honest human being? And again, am I serving God, or am I serving man? And I just think there's just such an interesting world out there right now. I mean, even on LinkedIn, sadly, it's like even in the vulnerability, people can say they're being vulnerable, but is there an ulterior motive there with the vulnerability? Like, am I doing this to get likes or whatever? But are we just truly being honest? Like, are we literally living for God or for some ulterior reason? And I just think it's an important conversation around entrepreneurship, because we will really be able to do what God's will for us is in this effort, to the extent that we are doing this for Him and not for others.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I appreciate you bringing that up. This actually kind of leads into my next question around, YCP has become, by all standards, I would assume most people would say this, very unanimous. Like everybody knows about it, or at least most people know about it in any major city, I would say, and very successful by all these measures. I'm curious on a couple of angles here. How does seeing this success, like, how does it make you feel? And do you ever have a challenge speaking about the success about it, because you want to give the glory to God, but you know that you also cooperated and worked hard?
Just feel immense gratitude. I mean, even at one of our conferences recently, and actually every conference at one of the opening masses, I find myself moved to tears because I mean, it's just amazing what God has done. And yes, He has invited me to be a little instrument, and I did say yes, and I kind of worked hard, and I'm so thankful for that. But even that is, He gave me the grace to say yes. And He's the one who gave me the tools to be His little vessel. Also, I have to thank my parents, right, who raised me as someone who could follow a unique path for my life. So, I just feel just tremendous gratitude.
Yeah, no, do you ever, I've wondered about this with people who achieve visibly visible success, right? Where, in this case, you have a group that's very well known. Do you ever, are there any particular struggles with humility about this? Because I've always wondered, like, you want to be accessible as a Catholic. You're not trying to be standoffish, but also, you have to like maintain your schedule. There's certain things that help you achieve these things. Like, how do you view that? And how do you, like, has there been any particular struggles with humility as you've grown?
You know, it's an interesting question, and I don't, I mean, perhaps there have been, but not so much, because again, like in humility, you recognize that this is God's apostolate, and he has ordained the effort, and millions of people have contributed to the success. And so it's easy to talk about the success because you know that so many hands have gone into this, and that God has allowed it to come to pass. And so I think if there's that spirit of sort of thankfulness and almost awe of what God can do through us, then it's easier to talk about the success. And I think along those lines, are we as willing to talk about the challenges? So it's almost like you feel better about talking about the success if you're also as open to talking about the hard
Mm,
times, right? Because we know in the entrepreneurial journey that there's seasons. There's great seasons and there's hard seasons. And so when you know that, it tempers kind of anything that you might say that's like, oh, great job, Jen, for this awesome accomplishment. I mean, sure, but there's about to be something hard around the corner. So, it kind of gives you a little bit more of that balance when you've gone through the highs and the lows, and then you can kind of speak about the success with a
hmm
little bit more honesty. So, I think it's just being tempered, being honest, but I think it is important to celebrate the wins also, right?
Yeah.
The accomplishments, you have to, for fuel to just keep going, you have to kind of rejoice and be glad and
Mm.
thank others around you and those who have contributed. Really, that can be a rallying moment to kind of, again, keep going, keep striving, and then just use it as an opportunity to give thanks.
Yeah, no, this is actually really really interesting. I've often wondered how we can get some of the very successful entrepreneurs who are Catholic, who are behind the scenes, who don't want to talk about their success, to be more vocal about it, because I just get the idea that it seems as though they don't exist, right? They are there behind the scenes usually, and they're doing a lot of things, and as a result, it leads people to the visible. I mean, depending on where you live, I come from a very rural area, so there's not, maybe not as many examples, but you know, you don't see the examples of success and how to be successful in a humble way, where you kind of, like you said, you recognize that this all comes from God ultimately, and you're just being humble to share it, that that's the case. But how do we get these people who have achieved great things to talk about it more? Because they're always afraid of being boastful. I mean, we just had it in a conversation this morning. I had He was like, he didn't want to share the all the items because he felt it would be boastful to share it, but in reality, it's sharing the example of what he did so that other people could imitate it. So, do you have any, like, I guess, guidelines on just how we would encourage people who have achieved great things to talk about that?
Yeah, because it's not about you, right? I think that's the most important thing. Is it's not about you. That quote from my brother's song, I'm selfish when I'm afraid. Are we being selfish and potentially not sharing the success? Because what if some of the lessons learned can help somebody else? What's the motive? Why am I afraid here? Why am I not sharing? Is it because, I think that somehow I'm going to be patting myself on the shoulder? Or, it's not about you. I remember once I was so nervous before I was about to do the first EWTN show, Life on the Rock. It was in the early days of YCP. And I called my mom right before the filming, and she said, Jen, it's not about you. And so, I think it's just such a great reminder that even in sharing our success, it's not about you. This is about this awesome work that God is allowing you to contribute to. And what an honor. It's such an honor to be a founder and to be an entrepreneur. And we give thanks to God. Thanks and great Thanksgiving, and we press forward. And it's an honor. And so it's I think that spirit of recognizing it's not about us, maybe in sharing the success, we can help others. I mean, and
hmm
I think it's really that simple.
Yeah, I like this a lot. I think it's very interesting to me, this idea that some of these items are much more. It's easier to develop the mentality properly before you've achieved something great. So it's like, get the basics there from the very beginning. And then from there, it'll really allow God to just kind of go and run with what you're doing. So that's part of the reason I'm trying to build this community, to get people to do that from the very early days, even if they're, just starting, right? Or just interested in starting. With running any, business or enterprise, there's always things that go wrong, as you've alluded to or mentioned, that can cause, anxiety. Do you have any particular experience that you want to share, dealing with tough times, and specifically, how did you kind of pull through that and recognize that, hey, I got to keep going?
So, at the very beginning, I was without a salary for a couple of years, and that was quite daunting, especially when nothing was proven. I mean, this was really just an idea that I was kind of throwing out there and developing. And so, again, talking about the virtue of courage, you have to know that you will face uncertainty, especially in these early days of whatever you're doing, but you have to push through these moments of doubt, and follow your inspiration, pursue your goal with confidence. There were a lot of challenges. I think of like the next phase of life, YCP's life after the initial founding phase, was really the growth phase where we, took this model and grew rapidly from one Dallas chapter to over 30 in about 7 years. And if I could tell you all of the challenges and all of the setbacks, I mean, you wouldn't believe it. Everything from funding challenges to employee setbacks to tension with YCP chapters. I mean, we even had, one of our first out of state chapters attempted to go rogue and compromise the whole mission. Thankfully, we were able to resolve things and go forward in harmony. But I think the lesson there is that you will encounter challenges as you grow and scale whatever you're doing, but you have to remain strong in perseverance so that God can bless your efforts. And then lastly, looking at this last kind of phase that I was talking about before, the harvest phase, I call it, where, we're really reaping in a lot of what we've sown. And, at the early stage, it was required courage, perseverance, but now it's about really trust that God is blessing these efforts. And that's what's allowed us to kind of shift past the baton to Peter, who's running YCP with just total excellence. And so, really have to hone in the virtue of trust as an entrepreneur to allow yourself to potentially pivot and adapt and just trust God and be open to his grace.
Yeah, no, I love that. You've got such great words to share. I really appreciate you doing this. Last major topic before we get to rapid fire is, now that you've built YCP, you moved on to just an advisor role, and Peter's running the show. What's next for you?
So, I mean, the big thing is just focusing on my incredible family. I have three boys, and then my beautiful daughter is the fourth, and they're so young and I mean, so amazing. They're all so different. And I mean, it's just the most incredible thing to watch them grow and flourish. And I'm so thankful that I get to be a mom and learn how to be a mom every day. And so I really want to focus on them. I love this role I have as YCP strategic advisor. It's really neat. It's going really well. To be able to continue to support, to be involved, to be a champion for the mission, to offer suggestions here and there. It's a joy for me to stay integrated like this. And so I definitely want to keep that going. Something I'm also cultivating is doing more coaching and mentorship. So I've actually had a number of people reach out to me, in light of this whole transition, perhaps as they're thinking of a leadership succession with their own initiative. I've been able to offer some advice and counsel, also coaching some people on the YCP senior leadership team. I'm really loving that because it's just a chance to kind of serve and, share and journey with someone. And so I really kind of want to grow in that skill set. And then lastly, I'm so excited to see what God has next for me. I mean, I'm sure something cool is on the horizon. So really just being open to that. And so being in a posture of listening.
I was gonna say I'll give it a year before you start something. It's very impossible. People who have this mentality, right? Especially when your whole identity is tied to it for what 13 years when you're doing this.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to just stop, right? And I think that it's important. This is not necessarily the topic I want to cover, but this idea that people who have been in the arena and who have achieved something, they have so many experiences that they can bring with them into their next thing, which makes them able to achieve even greater things. Like you could use the example of Elon Musk, right, where he takes and kind of rolls the experience and the abilities up and up and up to do more quote unquote impossible things. And I think especially as Catholics, we need to think that too. We can't just become complacent and realize that, hey, I've made in your case, you didn't sell YCP or anything, but people have sold companies like, hey, I've made my money. I'm just going to sit aside now. When it's your nature to build things, right? If you're an entrepreneur, it's your nature. It's our nature as humans to be co-creators, right? But we can't shy away from the continuing the journey. So we'll end with a bit of rapid fire here. So are there any particular? I know you mentioned some already, but are there any particular scriptures that really inspire you from an entrepreneurial standpoint that you kind of return to as you go through this journey?
So many, but for some reason, whenever I hear Romans 5, 1 through 5, boasting of our afflictions, knowing that affliction produces endurance, is proven character hope, and hope does not disappoint. I mean, we've talked so much today about resilience and about hope, and that's just honestly the recipe for, I think, success in life and in entrepreneurship. And so that verse really speaks to me.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I appreciate that. And then who is an entrepreneur that really inspires you?
Rich Kelly is an amazing businessman and entrepreneur. He's actually the founding chairman of YCP. Would not have been able to build this without him. And he once spoke at a YCP Dallas event, and he said, think like an entrepreneur, not like an employee. Entrepreneurs look at the world and see needs. They're driven to work hard because of a desire to meet those needs, not because of a paycheck. And so he challenges us to focus on that, serve others around you. He said it's not just good Christian values, it's also good business. So he
Hmm.
inspires me. He's a person who's really looking to make the most of this life and serve God with generosity.
Awesome. And then who is one of your favorite saints and why?
Can you guess?
I could take a lot of guesses, but I'll leave it to you.
Okay, Saint Joseph. He's my
Yes.
go-to. He's not only our spiritual father, he's the model for work. He's the patron of workers. He's the patron of the universal church, patron of families. His steadiness, his strength and leadership, his devotion to Jesus and Mary are really what I think are the necessary answers for our time.
Out of curiosity, are there any secondary saints? Because Saint Joseph is an easy one to pick. I mean, I love it too. But are there
Yeah.
any other people that other saints you tend to look up to a lot or reflect on their
Yeah,
works?
I mean, definitely Saint Therese of Lisieux. I mean, just that sort of childlike trust that is not weak, it's strong. And then also, I particularly love Saint Francis de Sales. Just he has a certain gentleness to him, and he was really big on the universality of our calling, right? The universal call to holiness that not just for priests and religious, but all of us are called to honor God. So I really love him. I love, of course, the heavy hitters, Saint Thomas Aquinas, and then I love the saints that my children are named after: Blaise, Damien, the one associated with Cosmas,
Hmm.
Saint Luke, and then also Saint Madeline and Sophie.
Yeah, Cosmos doesn't get enough love because it's always Damien and Cosmos, and nobody names their kid Cosmos these days.
We thought about it.
Thank goodness, because he's like, man, I'm not getting any of that love with those names. And then, what's your favorite devotion?
The rosary, for sure.
Amen.
Yeah, it's a weapon.
Awesome. Well, this has been really a pleasure. Is there any, I guess, for coaching or any purposes, anywhere people can reach you or any particular offer or ask that you have to share as we wrap up?
Find me on LinkedIn, send a little message with it, and I'd love to accept it and get to know you. And then also really look into YCP's Work Well, our career platform. We're really excited about that. We talked a lot about the importance of seeing work as a noble venture and really working for people who see it that way too. And so, I mean, this is a really, really cool community we're forming with YCP, and I would love people to look into it, as well as our mentorship program within YCP as well.
Amazing. I will definitely link all those things in the description. But this has been an absolute pleasure to have you on, Jennifer. Very, very much a fan of what you guys have built, and I'm glad to have been a part of it in many ways. And I hope to be, when I move to another city that's actually got it, to be part of it again. I'm in the
Thank you
middle of
so
nowhere right now.
much.
So, but yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, and thanks for everything you're doing too.
Absolutely. It's all for God.
Amen.
Hey everybody, thanks so much for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this, leave us 5 stars on your favorite podcast player. And if you're not already, go give us a follow on YouTube as well. We're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers so that we can become monetized someday. And then be sure to subscribe to the Saintly CEO, our free weekly newsletter that'll help you in under 1,000 words learn how to run your business like a saint and discover other Catholic entrepreneurs with our curated list of these folks as well. And finally, if you are looking for a group of other Catholic entrepreneurs and you want to learn from them, get some kind of advice from the community, consider joining our Catholic Founders Peer Group. It's $10 a month or $100 a year, so pretty much anybody can afford it. Just go to our Substack and upgrade to paid today, and you will also get access to all of our paywalled content as part of this. Thank you so much for tuning in. God bless you. All right, my daughter was making a little bit of noise in the background, so if you guys hear that, that's all right. But anyways, thank you guys so much for tuning in today. God bless you, and we will see you next time on Catholic Founders.